What kind of dog vanishes every night without a sound, only to return at dawn, covered in blood that isn't his? He doesn't chase. He doesn't run. He moves like he's following a secret no one else can hear. One woman thought it was just grief, until she followed him and uncovered something buried deep in the woods that should have never been found. If this opening gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and hit subscribe. Stories like this one, they don't end the way you think. It was late October in the high valleys of Wyoming, and the wind that blew through the town of Cedar Glen carried the sharp bite of winter's edge. Frost clung to the fields like a silvery veil, and the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke from nearby chimneys. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses into your chest and stays there, especially for those who live alone. Grace Holloway stood on the back porch of her cabin, arms wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her breath turning white in the cold air. The house behind her, built from weathered timber and worn by time, sat at the edge of a dense cedar forest, where the trees whispered to one another with every gust of wind. Grace was 57, with hair the color of steel wool and a posture that still carried hints of her former strength. Once a spirited ceramic artist known for her detailed work and steady hands, she had retreated into solitude after her husband, Dean, passed away in a hiking accident 3 years earlier. Her face bore the quiet lines of grief, softened only by the gentle way she moved through the world. She had the eyes of someone who had loved deeply and lost without warning. Beside her, the old dog door clattered softly in the wind, but it was bolted shut. Just like the fence gate, just like last night. And yet, Bruno was gone again. Bruno was a 5-year-old male, German shepherd, large and regal, with thick black and tan fur that glistened in the morning light. His body was lean, powerful, trained. But his eyes held something more than instinct, something almost mournful. Grace had inherited Bruno when Dean died. The dog had been Dean's partner in everything from firewood runs to winter hikes, and though Bruno never barked or begged, he had clung to Grace after the funeral like he understood the shape of her loneliness. This was the 3rd night in a row Bruno had vanished after midnight. Grace had locked every door and even wedged an old chair in front of the back flap, but come morning, there would be muddy paw prints on the porch and burrs in his fur. She told herself it was nothing. Dogs wandered, especially ones trained for search and rescue like Bruno. But deep down, she knew this wasn't restlessness. This was something else. The wind rose again, brushing her cheek like a hand she couldn't see. She turned back inside, refilled her cup of weak chamomile tea, and sat by the window. Her gaze drifted to the leash still hanging beside Dean's old coat. Just then, a low whine stirred from outside. Grace stood quickly and opened the door. Bruno padded in slowly, his sides heaving from exertion, his coat damp and matted with pine needles and something darker. He walked past her without meeting her eyes and lay down heavily in front of the fireplace. Grace knelt beside him, brushing a hand through his thick fur, then froze. There was no wound on him, but the tips of his fur were smeared with blood, not his. Before she could process the thought, a faint sound echoed from the back steps, a whimper, high-pitched and brittle. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped into the cold. There, nestled beside the firewood stack, was a tiny bundle of trembling fur. A puppy. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. A little mixed breed with one floppy ear, patches of white and rust-colored fur, and a back leg that hung twisted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were glassy with pain, and its ribs jutted through a thin coat like fence posts in winter fields. Grace crouched low, murmuring softly. The puppy didn't flinch as she scooped it up and wrapped it in her shawl. It didn't have the strength. She carried it inside, gently laying it on a thick folded towel near the hearth. Bruno watched quietly, unmoving, his dark eyes tracking every breath the puppy took. Grace fetched the emergency dog kit she kept in the kitchen drawer and started cleaning the wound with trembling hands. It wasn't a clean brie, more like a blunt force injury, the kind caused by a boot, not a fall. She gave the puppy water through a dropper, heated a rice bag for warmth, and sat down beside it, pressing a hand to her chest to slow the ache rising there. She looked at Bruno. "You brought him here," she whispered. "You knew." Bruno didn't move, but his eyes stayed on hers, unwavering. And in that look, Grace felt something heavy shift inside her. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a one-time thing. Something was happening out there, and Bruno was the only one trying to stop it. The morning sun slipped through the cedar trees like spilled honey, warming the frost-lined earth in patches as Grace Holloway stepped quietly onto her back porch. The tiny puppy Bruno had brought home lay sleeping in a basket lined with flannel and old scarves, his breathing shallow but steadier now. His injured leg had been wrapped with strips of soft cloth, and a thin splint fashioned from a carved paintbrush handle. Grace hadn't slept. Not from worry, exactly, but from a thrum of something deeper, older, a sense that the silence she had grown used to was not what she thought it was. Bruno, her German Shepherd companion, had not left the puppy's side all night. At one point, he had placed his head gently against the basket, his body still except for the occasional twitch of his ear at unfamiliar sounds. He had always been quiet, but this stillness felt deliberate, like he was waiting for her to understand. By mid-morning, the cabin had taken on a strange energy, one of preparation. Grace moved more quickly than usual, her hands wrapping leftover meat into small portions, her eyes scanning her bookshelf for the old wildlife rescue guide she hadn't touched since Dean's accident. She carried the puppy to the sunny windowsill in a shallow basket, watching as he blinked slowly in the light. Then she turned to Bruno. He stood by the door already, his ears alert, his gaze steady. "All right," she whispered. "Let's go." The trail behind her cabin led past a row of dying rose bushes, then turned sharply along a ridge where the cedar roots twisted like knotted rope. The air smelled of sap and damp moss. Bruno led the way, never too fast, always checking to be sure she was following. Grace didn't speak, didn't ask where they were going. Something about the way Bruno moved made her trust that whatever they were walking toward was meant to be found. They didn't have to go far. Near a fallen tree, just where the forest thickened, Bruno stopped suddenly. Grace slowed, scanning the underbrush. At first, she saw only the curl of dead leaves and the dappled shade cast by thick branches. Then the wind shifted, and she heard it, a faint rustling, almost imperceptible. Bruno crept forward and nosed gently at a hollow beneath the log. Grace knelt beside him and peered inside. There, shivering in a nest of wet leaves, was another dog. This one older than the puppy, maybe 4 months old, with a shaggy black coat streaked with white and a jagged scar that ran from its shoulder down to its paw. Its eyes were wide, glazed with fear, but when Bruno stepped closer, it didn't retreat. It whimpered once, low and broken, as if unsure whether to hope or hide. Grace reached into her coat pocket for the last bit of sandwich she had packed and broke it into small pieces. The dog sniffed the air, then inched forward on trembling legs. Bruno stood beside it, a calm sentinel, offering the kind of reassurance words couldn't. Grace wrapped the young dog in a towel and cradled it against her chest. Its bones pressed through its fur like sharp edges, and a sour smell clung to its coat. They returned home in silence. The forest, once still, now felt alive with unseen things. That evening, Grace set up a second basket by the fire and prepared a weak broth from chicken and rice. She cleaned the young dog's wound as gently as she could and rubbed a balm into its cracked paws. Bruno lay beside them, eyes flickering between the two rescues, always watching. Later, as the fire cracked softly and the sky outside deepened into indigo, Grace sat back and looked at them, two dogs saved from something she didn't yet understand. Her chest ached with the weight of it, but also with clarity. These weren't wild strays. Their injuries weren't accidental. Someone had left them out there. She turned to Bruno, brushing her hand along the thick fur of his neck. "You're not wandering," she said softly. "You're finding them." Bruno blinked slowly, his head resting on his paws, but she knew he understood. Whatever was happening in those woods, he had known it long before she had, and now he wasn't just bringing the animals home. He was bringing her with him. The sky over Cedar Glen was low and gray, pressing gently on the tree line as the afternoon waned. A thin drizzle fell steadily, soaking into the pine needles and turning the dirt path behind Grace's cabin into a soft, dark trail. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, casting a flickering glow on two recovering dogs curled up beside the hearth. The younger one, still unnamed, had begun to respond to Grace's voice, lifting his head whenever she entered the room, his tail tapping faintly. The older pup, the one they found under the fallen log, still flinched at sudden sounds but was eating well and had begun to sleep without twitching. Bruno lay between them like a guardian made of muscle and silence, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. Grace hadn't spoken to anyone in town since the second rescue. She wasn't sure what to say. That her dog was bringing her wounded animals from the woods? That something felt wrong beneath the soil of Cedar Glen, something she couldn't yet name. But the question had been burning in her mind since last night. Where were they coming from? These dogs weren't strays. They had once belonged to someone. That morning, with a backpack full of water, gauze, and a flashlight, Grace followed Bruno again. She didn't ask where he was going. She simply let him lead. The trail he chose this time was steeper, curving along the base of the hill and past a crumbling fence, half buried in moss. It wasn't a place she had ventured since Dean died. The woods opened into a clearing, and beyond that clearing stood the skeleton of a building, its roof sagging and its paint peeled down to raw wood. It had once been part of a meat-packing facility, long shut down after an inspection scandal nearly 15 years ago. Grace had forgotten it was even there, but Bruno hadn't. He moved around the building slowly, nose low, body tense. Grace stepped carefully, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and rust. She paused near a broken window, peering inside. Stacked cages lined the back wall, some bent, some empty. Others had tufts of fur caught in the wires. A metal sink in the corner was stained dark, and next to it, a wooden table with deep scratches like claws had fought their way across it. Grace swallowed hard. A sudden noise, wood snapping, made her duck behind a collapsed beam. Bruno growled low in his throat but stayed by her side. A figure was moving on the far side of the building, near the tree line. A man. He wore a long oilskin coat and walked with a heavy gait, limping slightly. From the distance, she could make out gray hair, pulled back in a loose tie, and a face shaded beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Grace didn't need to see more. She had seen him once at a town hall meeting 2 winters ago. His name was Doug Kinley. He ran a dog training center on the far edge of Cedar Glen, a private operation with a reputation for turning out perfectly obedient dogs, fast. He didn't come to town often, and when he did, he never lingered. People said he liked his privacy. Grace ducked lower, heart pounding. Bruno crouched beside her, his ears flattened, his body poised to spring if needed. Kinley stopped beside one of the metal bins behind the building. He opened it, looked inside, then slammed the lid shut and walked away. Grace waited until the sound of his boots faded into the wet woods before she stood and approached the bin. Bruno whined quietly, almost like he was warning her not to. She lifted the lid. Inside were blood-stained towels, several empty bags of dog feed, and something far worse, a collar, snapped and bent. It was too small for a grown dog. Grace stumbled back, her breath catching. Bruno nuzzled her hand, grounding her. She closed the lid and stared at the building. Then, slowly, she walked around to the front, scanning the grounds. A sign, long rusted over, still hung at an angle above the entry gate. It read, Cedar Glen Obedience and Working Dog Academy. The paint had been scrubbed clean in places, but the name still held its weight. Back at home, Grace sat in her kitchen, dripping wet, her hands trembling over a cup of untouched coffee. The dogs lay resting, unaware of what she had seen. Bruno sat near the window, staring out into the woods. I think you knew, Grace whispered. I think you've known all along. Bruno turned to look at her, and for a moment, the room was completely still. The next morning came wrapped in fog, soft and slow, like the forest itself was hesitating to wake. Grace Holloway stood at her kitchen counter, pouring boiling water into a chipped mug, her eyes drifting toward the tree line beyond the frosted window. The fire from last night had burned low, but the 2 rescued dogs still lay close to its warmth, twitching gently in sleep. Bruno was awake though, sitting upright near the door, his posture still, expectant. Grace hadn't said a word to him since they returned from the old facility. But his presence at her side, the unwavering way he had stayed close in the woods, was still heavy in her chest. She tucked her scarf around her neck and reached for her coat. Today, she needed to talk to someone who might know the truth. Not about the building. About Doug Kinley. Downtown Cedar Glen was quiet in the morning. Just 2 rows of shops, a diner that opened early, and the post office where everyone seemed to pass through. Grace stepped into Riverbend Feed and Supplies, where the bell chimed above her and the scent of hay and cedar oil hung in the air. Behind the counter stood a young woman with a narrow frame and long chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid. She wore a green flannel shirt over jeans and wiped her hands on a towel as she looked up. "Hi there, can I help you?" The woman's name tag read Mara. Her face was pale, dotted with light freckles, and her hazel eyes were thoughtful but guarded, like someone who had learned to be careful with trust. Grace offered a soft smile. "I think you're Doug Kinley's daughter, right?" The girl tensed, but nodded slowly. "I'm Grace Holloway. I live out near Old Creek Trail. I was hoping to ask you something, not about the store." Mara glanced toward the back door, then nodded for Grace to follow her into the break room. It was small, cluttered, with a kettle, a second-hand couch, and an old photo of a border collie taped to the wall. Once the door was closed, Mara folded her arms. "What do you want to know?" Grace paused, studying the girl. She couldn't have been more than 23, slim and soft-voiced, but her stance held a tension that didn't come from retail work. "I found something out near the old packing plant," Grace said carefully. "Cages, tools, blood. I saw your father there. I think he's leaving dogs in the woods, ones that are sick or broken." Mara didn't react at first. Her mouth tightened, her eyes shifting to the floor. "I know," she said finally, her voice no louder than a whisper. "I've known since I was 15. The silence that followed was filled only by the distant hum of a refrigerator. Grace waited. "I used to help him. He called it training. But when the dogs didn't perform right, if they barked too much, if they flinched, he said they weren't fit for homes. He'd tell me we were giving them a quick death instead of a long-suffering life. But I knew. I saw what happened. Not all of them died fast." Her voice cracked slightly. Grace stepped closer but said nothing. "One time," Mara continued, "he gave me this puppy. Said it had soft eyes, good potential. I named him Max. But the next week, Max wouldn't sit on command. My father said he was defective. He took him out behind the barn. Told me he'd send him off to a rescue. I waited a week. Then I went looking. I found Max half-starved near the tree line. He had a scar across his neck. I brought him water and hid him for days before he disappeared. I always hoped someone found him." Bruno's face came to Grace's mind, that same deep scar still visible beneath his thick coat, old but never forgotten. "What did Max look like?" Grace asked. "German Shepherd, cream undercoat, strong eyes, didn't bark much, just watched everything." Grace's throat tightened. "His name isn't Max anymore," she said softly. "He's mine now. His name is Bruno." Mara's breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her chest, eyes filling with something between relief and heartbreak. "I thought he was dead," she whispered. "All these years, I thought I left him to die." "You didn't," Grace said. "You saved him." Mara sat down, her hands shaking. "I didn't do enough. I never told anyone. I was too scared." "You're not the only one," Grace replied. "But if you're ready, I think we can do something about it now, together." And in that small room filled with dust and grain, 2 women sat side by side, joined not by blood or years, but by one dog's memory and a promise to make things right. The wind that night whispered through the trees like a warning, cold and unrelenting, rattling the pine branches above Grace Holloway's roof. Inside her cabin, the fire was burning low but steady. Bruno lay by the door, still and alert, his gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the glass. The 2 rescued dogs slept soundly near the hearth, their bodies curled into soft shapes of trust. Grace sat at her table, scribbling notes in the yellowed pages of an old ledger. Across from her, Mara Kinley hunched over her phone, pulling up images, maps, and the names of organizations that might be able to help. Their words were few, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was focused. Mara had come by after her shift at the feed store. She wore the same flannel shirt from earlier but looked more composed, her braid tighter, her voice firmer. There was a fire in her now, one Grace hadn't seen before, something raw and ready to act. It was just after midnight when they decided to go. Grace pulled on her coat and checked the flashlight. Mara took a deep breath, slid a small camcorder into her pocket, and nodded. Bruno rose without command and walked to the door. He didn't need a leash. He simply knew. The three of them moved through the woods like breath through branches. The night air was colder than expected, and the damp earth softened their steps. Grace carried a small satchel with gauze, antiseptic, and the memory card from her home camera. Every night since Bruno brought home the first puppy, she had documented everything, every injury, every scar. They followed the trail past the ridge, the one Bruno always took, but this time veered left, circling around the rear of the old packing plant. Mara pointed to a hidden gate she had seen as a child, used by delivery trucks long before the place shut down. They climbed the rusted bars carefully, the metal groaning beneath them, and dropped into the overgrown yard. Inside the building, the air was thick with rot and bleach. Flashlight beams sliced through the dark, revealing forgotten tools, piles of old feed bags, and a long drain running beneath a rusted table. Bruno stayed close, his body tense, ears perked. Then he stopped. At the back wall was a wooden door Grace had never noticed before, half covered by a tarp and old plywood boards. Mara stepped forward and pulled them aside. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a cramped room filled with supplies, buckets, towels, syringes, and in the corner, a shallow trench lined with dried blood. Grace felt her breath catch. This was not a mistake. This was a system. Mara took out her phone and began recording. He called it correction, she said quietly. When they didn't obey, this is where he brought them. Bruno stepped forward, sniffed the edges of the trench, then let out a low growl. His entire frame shivered, but he didn't move. Grace turned away, swallowing bile, then opened the bag and pulled out her old camera. She filmed the room slowly, methodically, making sure every corner was captured. They exited through the back and headed toward the supply shed. As they approached, a soft noise stopped them, a whimper, faint and quick. Bruno turned sharply, sniffed the air, then ran. Grace and Mara followed. Behind a collapsed pallet of crates was a metal kennel, half buried in leaves. Inside was a puppy, maybe 6 weeks old, with mottled fur and a swollen eye. Grace knelt quickly, cut through the rusted latch with a pair of pliers, and gently lifted the trembling creature into her arms. Its body was limp from cold and hunger, but it stirred weakly when Bruno pressed his nose to its belly. Mara wrapped it in her flannel and tucked it against her chest. "We're not done yet," Grace whispered. Suddenly, a sharp beam of light burst through the trees behind them. "Who's there?" Doug Kinley's voice rang through the dark. They froze. Grace turned, shielding the puppy instinctively. Doug stood by the main gate, holding a flashlight and wearing a thick coat, his breath visible in the cold. "I know you're there," he said. "I saw the cameras go out. You think you're smart, Grace, bringing her back here?" Mara stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "No more lies, Dad. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Doug stared at her. Then his eyes shifted to Bruno, who had taken position between the women and the man, growling low, his teeth barely visible. "You're making a mistake," Doug said. "No," Grace replied, her voice calm. "The mistake was thinking no one would ever look closely enough." Doug hesitated. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the dark. They didn't chase him. Instead, they carried the puppy back through the woods, wrapped tight in warmth, shielded by silence, guided by Bruno's quiet strength. The sun rose with a clarity Cedar Glen hadn't seen in weeks, casting long golden shafts through the thinning pine canopy and melting the thin crust of frost that coated the fields. Grace Holloway stood on the back steps of her cabin, her fingers wrapped around a mug of black coffee gone lukewarm, her eyes following the path Bruno had taken hours before. But this morning, he hadn't gone alone. Mara had left with him, a quiet determination in her steps, a bundle of printed reports under one arm, and a flash drive looped to her keychain. Inside, The small brown puppy they'd rescued 2 nights ago stirred gently in its basket. The swelling around its eye had gone down. It had begun to lift its head when Grace called, even made a hoarse bark that felt more like breath than sound. She had named him Birch. It was the first name she had spoken aloud in her home since Dean passed. At 9:10 a.m., a knock sounded at the front door. Grace opened it to find a man in his early 60s standing there, tall and solid, with wide shoulders, gray curls beneath a flat cap, and an expression of careful intent. He wore a forest green utility jacket and carried a leather binder tucked beneath his arm. "Miss Holloway? I'm Colton Reyes, Wyoming Animal Welfare Board. Mara Kinley forwarded me your materials." Grace stepped aside without a word. Colton entered with a slow gait, scanning the room without judgment. He paused when he saw Birch, offered a small nod, then set his binder on the table. "I've seen worse," he said, opening the cover, "but not by much, and rarely this organized." They sat at the table, while Grace handed over the flash drive and a printout of timestamps. Colton asked few questions, only what was necessary, and listened intently as Grace recounted what she had seen inside the facility. His demeanor was calm, his voice even, like someone used to hearing things most people wouldn't believe. "She told you everything?" Grace asked, meaning Mara. "She told me enough. What you've got here should be enough for an emergency seizure and criminal investigation. I've contacted the sheriff's office in Jackson County. They're on their way now with 2 officers and a state vet. I'll coordinate transport for any live animals we find." Grace nodded slowly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and damp cedar. Hours later, she stood near the property line of Kinley's dog training facility, watching from behind a low thicket as the convoy of vehicles rolled through the gravel road. Bruno sat beside her, still and attentive, his eyes tracking every movement. A white veterinary van pulled to a stop beside a rusted feeder. 2 county cruisers flanked the front gate. Sheriff Naomi Dillard stepped out first. She was in her late 40s, tall with a lean build and steady posture. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, and the glint of her badge caught the light as she approached the gate. Behind her came Deputy Lance Monroe, stocky and quiet, carrying a bolt cutter and a warrant. When they entered the property, they didn't hesitate. No drawn guns, no shouting, just practiced motion and deliberate silence. Doug Kinley was not seen at first. The front door of the house was shut. The barn was locked. But the moment they stepped inside, the truth unfolded like a scream held in too long. Over 20 dogs were recovered in total, some barely alive, some already gone. The youngest were transferred into heated crates, their fragile bodies wrapped in donated blankets. The older ones were given mild sedatives before being moved. Colton and the vet, Dr. Ellie Pearson, cataloged each one, taking photos, noting injuries, and tagging collars. Grace walked through the barn as Bruno led her gently through the chaos. One cage had been left open, the door unlatched as if someone had been interrupted mid-act. She found no sign of Doug. Until later. Deputy Monroe located him hiding in the side tool shed, crouched beside a fuel drum, his hands stained and his face pale. He did not resist. He did not speak. They let him out in cuffs as reporters from a local paper snapped photos behind the fence. That evening, Grace returned home with Bruno and Mara. The shelter in Jackson agreed to house the animals temporarily. Dr. Pearson had taken Birch to monitor overnight. Colton promised full follow-up. Grace poured 3 cups of coffee, added cinnamon to one the way Mara liked it, and stood at the porch with them. The wind had calmed. The sky was awash in lavender and amber. The forest bathed in soft light. Mara reached down and placed a hand on Bruno's head. "He was always trying to tell someone," she said. Grace nodded, and when no one listened, he found another way. Bruno didn't move. But when the first owl called from the trees, he lifted his head and exhaled, a long breath as if releasing what he had carried for years. Sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that never speak. In the quiet loyalty of a dog, in the courage of a broken-hearted girl, in the patience of a woman who chose to see what others ignored, we find a truth that lingers long after the noise fades. Love, when given without condition, can uncover what cruelty tried to bury, and in the smallest acts of protection, even in the silence of paw steps through pine, justice begins. If this story found its way to your heart, consider staying with us. There are more stories waiting, of courage, of kindness, of the unseen becoming unforgettable.